Across history, great minds sought meaning through adversity, their hearts often tested by the deepest human fears. What drives us to turn our quiet anxieties outward, to see a monstrous evil in the shadows of our own uncertainty? Like the souls we will meet, we seek clarity and calm, a soothing explanation for the turbulence of life. This journey is an hour of rest, an intellectual descent into unsettling stories that guide us toward peace. We begin a journey through 20 pivotal moments, from the fear-ridden villages of Europe to the cold virtue of Puritan New England, exploring the psychological crucible of the witch hunts. We are not judging, only observing the resilient spirit that survived the panic, guiding us all toward rest. Let your mind drift into the unsettling but ultimately calming embrace of these tales, not of evil, but of the human struggle for peace. The shadow of the unknown. In the late medieval night, life was a fragile, flickering flame. The world was cold, dark, and utterly unpredictable. Plague, famine, and ceaseless war were not just events, they were existential dread made manifest. A crushing, daily adversity that defied logic and demanded an explanation. When there is no scientific framework to explain suffering, the human mind, in its resilient attempt to find meaning, instinctively reaches for the supernatural. This era was psychologically primed, burdened by collective anxiety, searching for a visible hand behind the invisible hand of fate. This deep-seated fear was a vast, formless shadow, and the psyche could not tolerate such shapeless terror. The anxiety had to be made solid, given a name, and confined to a tangible enemy. This psychological process, known as projection, became the necessary defense mechanism. Instead of confronting the terrifying reality of random suffering, the mind projected that horror onto an external controllable source, the witch. This allowed people to shift from being passive victims of fate to active warriors against a defined evil. This false sense of control offered a profound, though tragic, form of meaning in chaos. The resulting witch hunt was less a legal event and more a collective psychological defense strategy. By identifying, isolating, and punishing the accused, the community gained a temporary soothing release from its unbearable internal pressure. The anxiety did not disappear, but it was metabolized into rage and action. Those targeted were often already on the social margins, the old, the poor, the nonconformist, making them psychologically easier to label as other. Their destruction served as a dramatic communal ritual, a performance of cleansing that promised a temporary return to order and divine favour. The human need for structure, even a brutally defined one, overcame the simple truth of innocence. But this defense mechanism was a fragile one. As we move into the next chapter, we'll see how this projected fear was quickly codified and shared, transforming private anxiety into a public, inescapable conformity. The simple act of fitting in became a matter of life and death, shaping not just belief, but behaviour itself. As the fear of the invisible plague settled over the land, the human mind began to search for a visible hand. The comfort of conformity. In an isolated village, life hinged on absolute interdependence. Every gaze held judgment, and every shared belief was a necessary anchor against the stormy seas of the age. When the anxiety of the witch hunt emerged, the psychological pressure to conform became overwhelming. This phenomenon, known as social proof, dictates that in ambiguous situations, we look to others for the correct way to think and act. In the witch hunt, the correct action was to accuse, or at least to agree with the accusation. The simple terror of being the odd one out fueled the fire. Dissent was not merely disagreement, it was immediate suspicion. If one chose to defend an accused neighbour, they risked the crowd's judgment being instantly transferred. Psychologically, it was far safer to participate in the collective delusion than to stand alone in the fragile defence of truth. The inherent human need to belong, to be part of the in-group, was weaponized by fear. The hunt was a brutal test of loyalty, demanding that individuals sacrifice their internal moral compass to align with the external hysterical consensus. This compulsion to comply was reinforced by groupthink, where the desire for harmony in the group overrides a realistic appraisal of alternatives. The authorities often encouraged this, turning skepticism into a sign of heresy. Doubt became a dangerous personal adversity, while agreement offered a soothing sense of communal purpose. For many, accusing was a way of establishing their own meaning and virtue. It was the quickest, most effective path to proving one's goodness and loyalty to God and community. In a world full of unseen threats, the perceived safety of the pack was the only viable path to psychological survival. The tragedy lay in how easily a community's shared need for peace through meaning turned into an engine of destruction. The resilience required to break conformity was rare, a profound display of individual courage against the current of a collective delusion. Before widespread accusations could take hold, the process needed a formal framework, a text that gave the human desire to blame divine justification. But the tide of blame needed a fuel, a shared belief that turned whispered doubts into shouted certainties. The birth of the scapegoat. The human mind, when overwhelmed by chronic stress and adversity, possesses a powerful impulse to simplify complex problems. In times of socio-economic collapse, when the actual systems of power were too vast and untouchable to challenge, the need for a scapegoat became a psychological imperative. The theory of scapegoating explains how a group redirects its communal frustration and accumulated suffering onto a single powerless target. This act is deeply cathartic, providing immediate, if false, relief. The suffering is not solved, but the focus shifts from the internal rot of the community to the external figure of the accused. The psychological function of the witch was to act as a universal container for all societal ills. If the crops failed, it was the witch. If a child sickened, it was the witch. If one felt an impure thought, it was the influence of the witch. This allowed the accusers to maintain their self-image as pious and blameless, channeling their own anxieties and failings into a personified evil. This redirection of blame offered a twisted form of meaning. The world wasn't randomly cruel, but simply under attack, and they were the defenders. In this cycle of blame, the witch hunt became an act of self-purification. The accused, through their suffering, symbolically carried away the collective guilt and fear of the community. Yet, the relief was always temporary, because the actual causes of the adversity, famine, disease, social inequality remained. The psychic pressure inevitably built again, demanding a new scapegoat. This relentless cycle demonstrates the fragile and unsustainable nature of finding meaning through external blame rather than internal resilience. The true adversity was the failure to look inward. To solidify this pattern, the fear required a unifying text, a handbook that not only justified the hunt, but institutionalized the method of identifying the scapegoat. The human mind required a rigid, authoritative structure to reassure itself that the horrific acts were righteous. The psychological need to blame found its framework in the dark prose of judicial and religious authority. The Malleus Maleficarum's grip in 1487, two inquisitors published the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches. This text was not merely a guide, it was a psychological weapon that institutionalized and justified the panic. By codifying every aspect of witchcraft, from supposed powers to interrogation techniques, it provided a seemingly infallible authority that appealed to the human need for certainty. In an age characterized by profound uncertainty and adversity, the Malleus became a deeply comforting document, offering the definitive meaning behind suffering. The book's primary psychological function was to enable confirmation bias. It trained the reader, the judge, the priest, the terrified villager, to see only what they expected to see. Every ambiguous event, every suspicious detail of a person's life could be interpreted through the Malleus's rigid framework as proof of guilt. A woman's silence was proof of demonic secrecy, her passionate defense, proof of satanic defiance. The text provided an escape hatch from rational thought, ensuring that the conclusion, guilt, was reached before the investigation even began. For those in authority, the Malleus offered a psychological shield against doubt and the heavy burden of consequence. It validated their brutal methods, transforming torture into a morally acceptable tool for uncovering spiritual truth. This gave the inquisitors a perverse sense of righteous purpose and meaning in their difficult work, reinforcing their conviction that they were fighting the devil himself. This intellectual certainty allowed the moral panic to transition from a localized hysteria into a systematic Europe-wide persecution supported by seemingly unshakable doctrine. The enduring power of the Malleus lay in its ability to hijack the human pursuit of truth, replacing it with the pursuit of a predetermined narrative. It taught entire societies to fear their own neighbours and trust a book over their own eyes and hearts. The stage was now set for the panic to consume specific, vulnerable populations. The framework was set, but the terror was personalised, beginning with the vulnerable, the accused, outsiders and healers. The people most often targeted were not randomly chosen. They were the psychologically and socially vulnerable, the midwives, the elderly, the women who lived alone, and those who practiced local, often herbal, healing. The underlying motive was the psychological process of othering, a mechanism by which an in-group defines itself by contrasting its own perceived virtue with the perceived faults of an out-group. This simple division creates a comforting moral clarity, a necessary structure for those struggling with adversity. These witches were often repositories of pre-Christian folk knowledge and independent healing methods that stood outside the rigid male-dominated authority of the church and medicine. The psychological threat they represented was one of independence and alternative meaning. Their self-sufficiency challenged the societal structure that claimed to provide all legitimate comfort and cure. The panic, therefore, served to violently reassert control, eliminating any competing source of comfort or knowledge that the populace might turn to instead of the approved established powers. Furthermore, the accusations were often rooted in deep-seated fear of female power, particularly the power of creation and destruction, embodied by midwives and healers. By attributing their knowledge to the devil, society found a way to condemn and control this feared independence. The narrative of the evil witch allowed for the projection of male anxieties about female influence, giving them a righteous path to subjugation. This act, however cruel, provided a sense of societal purpose and reclaimed a perceived structural meaning for the community. The persecution of these outsiders was the most concrete evidence that the community had successfully externalized its internal struggle. By eliminating the scapegoat, they felt they had eliminated the actual source of their pain. The resilience of those who survived the initial wave lay in their ability to stay silent, to blend in, and to abandon any trait that made them distinct. The social fabric began to fray as neighbour turned on neighbour, driven by the seductive power of a public accusation. The contagion of accusation. Once the psychological framework was established, the witch hunt behaved like an emotional and social contagion. The initial, isolated case quickly snowballed into a mass hysteria, a collective trance that suspended disbelief and logic. This phenomenon relies on social transmission, the rapid, exponential spread of an idea or behaviour within a group. It is driven by the simple, terrifying observation that everyone else seems to believe it, reinforcing the pressure to conform and the validity of the shared delusion. The accuser became the most powerful figure in the community, wielding psychological power previously reserved for judges or priests. Children, servants, or the otherwise powerless suddenly found themselves with the authority to point a finger at anyone no matter their status. This dramatic shift in the social hierarchy was a key feature of the hysteria, creating an intoxicating, temporary sense of meaning for those who had none. For the accusers, the act was not merely survival, but a terrifying ascent to temporary social significance, a sudden relief from the adversity of their obscurity. The hysteria was also a release for pent-up social tension and interpersonal grudges. Old debts, property disputes, and long-simmering resentments could all be settled under the cloak of spiritual necessity. The hunt provided a morally sanctioned path for communal aggression. This outpouring of suppressed frustration provided a destructive, collective expression of purpose, replacing the quiet, difficult work of resolution with the dramatic theatre of accusation. The psychological relief derived from finally releasing these tensions ensured that the cycle of accusation continued unabated. The tragedy of the contagion is its self-sustaining nature. Every new accusation validates the previous ones, deepening the community's commitment to the false reality. Only an external force, or the horrifying realization that the system had begun to devour the innocent and powerful alike, could break the spell. The panic required an engine of enforcement, a figure of authority whose own anxieties shaped the Inquisition. The interrogator's burden. The witch hunt required not just accusers, but dedicated interrogators and judges, individuals who had to reconcile the escalating violence with their own moral framework. For the interrogator, the process was a psychological struggle framed as a righteous purpose. They were taught to believe that torture was necessary to save the accused soul from Satan, shifting the moral burden from themselves onto the devil. This cognitive maneuver was a powerful self-defense mechanism, protecting them from the human adversity of guilt and doubt. For the accused, the interrogation chamber was an environment of total psychological domination designed to induce learned helplessness. Hope was systematically stripped away. Any defense was twisted into a sign of guilt, and any show of integrity was met with escalating physical and psychological pain. The accused soon understood that survival was not found in proclaiming truth, but in articulating the lie the interrogator was desperate to hear. The search for a way out became a desperate quest for an alternative, though false meaning, the meaning of a confession. The false confession was the ultimate triumph of the panic. It not only saved the accused from further immediate torture, but also provided final, irrefutable social proof that the witch hunt was valid. The confession validated the judge, the accusers, and the entire community's shared terror. In this tragic calculus, the accused's truth, their genuine purpose, was sacrificed for the community's temporary manufactured sense of order and peace. The path to survival became a path to collaboration with one's own destruction. Yet even in this suffocating darkness, some found an extraordinary quiet resilience. They refused to speak the lie, choosing their inner truth over the promise of temporary respite. This refusal highlights how the human need for integrity, for self-worth, can supersede the most powerful survival instinct. Yet even within the terror, moments of profound psychological resistance and a clinging to truth shone through. The power of denial and conviction. The interrogation was the ultimate test of individual conviction. For many, the relentless torture eventually broke their will, forcing a confession out of sheer survival instinct. But for a powerful few, the adversity of the chamber refined their inner conviction, turning it into an unyielding shield. These were the souls who had found a more profound source of meaning than the temporary relief of a lie, the unshakable truth of their own innocence. The psychological resilience of the deniers stemmed from an integration of self and belief. Their core identity was inextricably linked to their innocence, their faith, or their virtuous life. To confess to being a witch was not merely to lie, it was to commit spiritual suicide and erase the purpose of their entire existence. The refusal to break became an ultimate act of self-actualization, a quiet victory of the individual spirit over the collective terror. For these individuals, dying with their truth intact was psychologically preferable to living a life based on a fundamental betrayal of self. This choice, the pursuit of death with integrity, stands as a stark contrast to the fear-driven conformity of the masses. It highlights a painful paradox. Sometimes the deepest meaning is found not in seeking life, but in accepting an unjust death to protect the sacred inner truth. The accused who stood firm became, in time, powerful moral figures, whose sacrifice ultimately led the community out of the madness. The power of their conviction lay the groundwork for skepticism. When good, respected, and truthful people chose death over a lie, the collective conscience of the community began to stir. Doubt, the healthy counterpart to fear, was slowly allowed to return. This quiet denial was the first necessary crack in the edifice of hysteria. As the flames of European panic began to dim, the same psychological shadow was cast across a new world. The waning of European frenzy. The European witch craze did not end with a sudden, dramatic enlightenment, but with a slow, grinding psychological exhaustion. Maintaining a state of mass hysteria requires immense emotional energy, constantly fueled by fear, accusation, and vigilance. Eventually, the social cost of the witch hunt, the loss of neighbours, the financial ruin of entire districts, the sheer emotional adversity of living in constant terror, simply outweighed the temporary psychological relief it offered. The community grew tired of finding meaning through destruction. The return to stability began with a slow, quiet psychological shift. The reassertion of rational stability. Skepticism, previously suppressed by conformity, began to re-emerge, bolstered by jurists and philosophers. People started to question the illogical nature of the accusations and the inherent contradictions in the confessions. The most profound realization was that the system designed to root out evil was itself generating the worst form of adversity, the systematic destruction of innocence. This painful truth forced a societal reappraisal of what constituted true virtue and purpose. Judicial authorities began to impose stricter rules of evidence, making it almost impossible to prosecute on spectral or coerced grounds. This legal shift reflected a deeper psychological decision to prioritize order and the rule of law over the chaotic, self-destructive demands of mass fear. The community chose to find its meaning in rebuilding social trust, rather than continuing to tear it down. The focus of resilience shifted from individual conviction to collective intellectual sobriety. But the pattern of panic was merely dormant, not destroyed. The human tendency to project fear, to seek a scapegoat, remained a fundamental psychological vulnerability. History was merely waiting for the next crucible of stress to ignite the same pattern. The old fear had faded, yet the human mind's pattern of finding an enemy would resurface in the unfamiliar landscape of Puritan virtue. Bridging the oceans of fear. The voyage from the old world to the new was an ocean crossing of physical space, but not of psychological stress. The European settlers who arrived in the American colonies, particularly the Puritans, carried with them a profound inherited sense of adversity. They viewed their settlement as a fragile outpost of God's order, surrounded by a wilderness, the literal domain of the devil. This high-stakes environment amplified the psychological need for vigilance and certainty, making them deeply vulnerable to the old patterns of moral panic. The core fear remained universal, the terrifying unpredictability of life. In Europe, the panic was fueled by plague and famine. In New England, it was fueled by crop failure, conflicts with native populations, and the constant threat of disease in an unforgiving climate. In both settings, the existential adversity was processed the same way, by finding a source of evil that could be defined, fought, and defeated. The witch was the perfect psychological tool to transform overwhelming, formless anxiety into a manageable, personified enemy. The difference lay mainly in the intensity of the group identity. Puritan society was built on an extreme form of conformity and a collective search for profound spiritual purpose. This psychological environment created a far lower tolerance for nonconformity or doubt. Where European courts had a structure of review, the Salem courts were initially driven by the raw, unfettered moral certainty of a highly isolated and self-regulating community. The pursuit of spiritual meaning became dangerously intertwined with the pursuit of social purity. The journey to Salem is a lesson in the universality of human psychological defense mechanisms. Given enough stress and a shared narrative, any community can fall prey to the comfort of external blame. The collective human mind, when facing unbearable stress, defaults to the simplest, most destructive form of order. We pause now in this journey, carried by the currents of history, to reflect on the psychological context that binds these ages. The witch hunts, across continents and centuries, form a terrifying archive of collective human anxiety. To understand them is to confront the deepest societal and individual adversity faced by pre-modern peoples. Our journey has traced three main psychological landscapes: the despair of medieval Europe, seeking to blame external evil for the Black Death and famine; the systematic terror of early modern Europe, where the printing press weaponized fear with texts like the Malleus; and the colonial Puritan struggle for spiritual and physical survival. In each setting, the same psychological core was at play: the unbearable pressure of uncertainty. When people cannot control their reality, they seek control over their narrative. The accused witch was a narrative convenience, a simple answer that offered the community a temporary, albeit brutal, sense of shared purpose. This unified thread of seeking meaning through destruction, the ultimate act of externalizing inner conflict, is the tragic engine of this history. We are observing the human mind's desperate, resilient attempt to impose order onto chaos. We shift now to the singular, intense outbreak in Salem, Massachusetts, a historical moment so focused and intense it serves as a psychological laboratory for the study of moral panic. The strict, isolated nature of the Puritan community created a perfect crucible. Every fear was magnified, and every spiritual rule was non-negotiable. This compressed, intense environment accelerated all the psychological mechanisms we have discussed: conformity, scapegoating, and the authority of the accuser. The events of 1692 were not an aberration of history, but the inevitable consequence of a society pushed to its psychological breaking point by the adversity of its own creation. We move from the theoretical roots of panic to its devastating real-world application, watching how the fragile structure of a small community buckled under the weight of its own anxiety. We prepare to hear the intimate stories of those who suffered under a panic that demanded absolute conformity. If the quiet echoes of these troubled souls and their journey toward meaning have guided your mind to this moment of reflection, consider joining our growing community. We seek to understand the resilience of the past to find peace in our present. Subscribe to The Psychological Historian to continue these restful, deep dives into the human spirit. Let these stories of adversity and the search for purpose guide your nights to restful sleep. As we continue now, the intimate, complex stories of Salem unfold, guiding us further into the shadows and toward the light of self-reflection. The Puritan landscape of Fear, Salem Village in 1692 was a community defined by its extreme religious purpose. The Puritans sought to build a city upon a hill, a pristine, morally perfect society that demanded unceasing vigilance. Psychologically, this created an environment of continuous inner conflict. Every action, thought, and word was subject to intense self-scrutiny, measured against an impossible standard of righteousness. This constant moral monitoring led to an immense psychological burden, the adversity of trying to achieve the unattainable. The community lived in a constant state of perceived siege. Surrounded by a harsh wilderness and non-Puritan neighbours, the devil was not a theological concept, but a tangible, ever-present threat. This heightened sense of danger amplified the psychological need for conformity. Any minor deviation from expected behavior was not a personal failing, but a crack in the town's collective spiritual armor, providing an entry point for Satan. The stakes were terrifyingly high, not just for the individual, but for the salvation of the entire settlement. This atmosphere of spiritual anxiety prepared the ground for hysteria. The intense emotional energy of constant self-suppression had nowhere to go. Psychologically, the projection of this internal anxiety onto an external demonic force was a massive relief. By identifying witches, the community could externalize its own moral failings, preserving the illusion of Puritan purity while aggressively fighting the evil it had created. This tragic search for a righteous meaning through external combat consumed the community. The profound vulnerability of Salem lay in the fact that its spiritual commitment was also its psychological weakness. The collective need for a perfect spiritual purpose ultimately drove it to its most imperfect destructive end. The strictness of their virtue became the very engine of their destruction, proving that the greatest threat can come from the inside. It was within this fragile, cold landscape of virtue that a spark of hysteria would ignite in a single small home. Tituba's stories and the power of suggestion. The spark of the Salem panic ignited in the home of Reverend Parris, fueled by the psychological power of suggestion. In the cold kitchen, the enslaved woman, Tituba, told the impressionable young girl stories of her Caribbean folklore, tales filled with magic, fortune-telling, and dark figures. For the Puritan mind, which strictly divided the world into God's domain and the devil's, these tales of the supernatural were immediately categorized as evidence of the demonic. The young girls, starved for imaginative release in their austere environment, found a terrifying and thrilling source of meaning. The resulting fits, the girls' uncontrollable physical and emotional outbursts, were initially a response to the psychological weight of the suggestion, an extreme, uninhibited release of pent-up energy and adversity. Yet, once authorities confirmed the fits as the work of the devil, the girls were instantly elevated. They transitioned from being subjects of discipline to agents of spiritual importance. Their hysteria was validated, transforming their uncontrollable behavior into a socially sanctioned form of power. This shift created an unconscious psychological feedback loop. The sicker they appeared, the more attention and authority they received. The stories, initially a simple form of entertainment, became the rigid framework for the panic. Tituba's later confession, likely coerced, was an act of psychological survival, providing the authorities with the narrative they required to proceed. She chose to articulate the accepted lie, confirming the community's terror and giving it an irrefutable foundation. The power of suggestion had succeeded in creating a shared delusional reality. Once the fits were sanctioned as divine proof, the psychological dynamic of the village shifted irrevocably. The community had sacrificed truth for the temporary comfort of having a definable enemy. As the first accusations took hold, the children involved demonstrated a deep psychological power, the authority of the accuser, the authority of the afflicted. In the restrictive Puritan environment, the young afflicted girls found themselves suddenly elevated to a position of unprecedented social power. The fits were, psychologically, an extreme form of attention-seeking, an understandable reaction in a world that typically demanded silence and absolute obedience from children and women. When the community accepted their behavior as irrefutable evidence of spiritual warfare, the girls were given a compelling new identity and a profound, terrifying purpose. Their hysteria was the ultimate form of rebellion that was paradoxically sanctioned by the highest authorities. The fits themselves were a performance, deeply rooted in the psychology of the crowd. Their contortions and cries provided a dramatic focal point for the communal fear, lending a chilling visual proof to the invisible adversity of the devil. This social affirmation reinforced the behaviour, creating a positive feedback loop. The more convincing the performance, the more belief and power the girls gained. This enabled them to maintain their sense of meaning and control within the panic. This sudden reversal of the social order created an intoxicating sense of authority. They could wield the full weight of the law, turning their personal grudges or subconscious fears into lethal accusations. This power was a psychological release from the pressure of Puritan conformity, but it came at an unforgivable cost to the community. It created a terror where the weakest members of society could destroy the strongest, paralysing the town's ability to use logic or defence. The tragedy of the afflicted was that they too were victims, first of a restrictive society, and then of the destructive psychological power they accidentally unleashed. Their craving for attention and authority in a repressive environment inadvertently brought about the destruction of their community. The panic would not be satisfied by the margins. It would reach for figures of great social standing. Sarah Good, the face of marginalisation. Sarah Good was one of the first accused, and her story exemplifies the psychological safety found in targeting the already marginalised. She was poor, often homeless, a beggar, and known for her contentious temper, a perfect repository for the community's projected anxieties. Targeting her required little cognitive dissonance. She was already other, making it psychologically easy to condemn her as the physical manifestation of the devil's adversity. Her existence outside the social norm provided the community with an immediate satisfying scapegoat. The community's prejudice made her guilt a foregone conclusion. The accusations against her were trivial. A child sickened after she begged for food, a pig died after she passed by. In a panic, these random events were instantly organised by the mind into a pattern of evil, reinforcing the comfort of confirmation bias. Her lack of social standing meant there was no one with enough influence to defend her, ensuring that the process of condemnation was swift and unimpeded. This allowed the panic to build momentum on the backs of the most defenceless. Yet, Sarah Good also displayed a quiet form of psychological resilience, rooted in defiance. Her famous final words, in which she condemned her accuser, were a final, desperate attempt to assert her truth and reclaim her purpose. She found her meaning not in submission or confession, but in a final verbal confrontation with the system that was consuming her. This act of verbal integrity, however futile, stands as a testament to the powerful human impulse to defend one's inner reality against external terror. The community's willingness to condemn Sarah Good and her infant child demonstrated the depth of the panic's self-deception. The psychological need to maintain the delusion surpassed all bounds of basic human decency and logic. Yet the panic would not be satisfied by the margins. It would reach for figures of great social standing. Rebecca Nurse and the threat to order. The accusation of Rebecca Nurse, a pious, respected, elderly woman of unimpeachable character, sent shockwaves through the psychological foundations of Salem. Her integrity challenged the entire premise of the panic, forcing the community into a state of acute cognitive dissonance. The community held two contradictory beliefs, that the accusers were infallible and that Rebecca Nurse was virtuous. The mind struggles to reconcile such opposites, and the resulting stress threatened to collapse the entire framework of the witch hunt. Her condemnation required an intense psychological effort from the authorities. If the devil could possess such a devout person, then no one was safe. This logic, while terrifying, was the only way to resolve the dissonance without abandoning the panic altogether. It allowed them to maintain the illusion of their righteous purpose by making the devil's power seem infinitely greater and more insidious. The accusers, under pressure, simply claimed the devil was using her spectral form to torment them, making her virtue irrelevant. The community was divided. Many risked their own safety, breaking from the pattern of conformity to sign petitions supporting her. This act of moral courage, this willingness to face the adversity of the crowd, was the first significant crack in the hysteria. It demonstrated that some individuals valued rational truth and social trust over the soothing comfort of a shared delusion. The sheer weight of her moral integrity forced a genuine, agonizing internal conflict upon the townspeople. Rebecca Nurse's quiet, dignified refusal to lie to save her life, a profound display of seeking meaning through truth, served as a crucial moral anchor. Her execution, more than any other, forced the community to confront the horrifying gap between their professed values and their destructive actions. To sustain the terror, a theory was needed to explain how a virtuous person could be ensnared: the concept of spectral evidence. Spectral evidence and the suspension of logic. To bridge the gap created by accusing people like Rebecca Nurse, the courts relied heavily on spectral evidence. Testimony that the spirit or spectre of the accused was attacking the afflicted. This concept was the ultimate psychological loophole, allowing the community to suspend all empirical logic. Since only the afflicted could see the spectre, there was no way for the accused to defend themselves. The burden of proof was completely inverted, and truth was determined by shared, unprovable delusion. The use of spectral evidence demonstrates the power of groupthink to override basic rational faculties. In the grip of panic, the community collectively chose to accept the impossible over the terrifying adversity of acknowledging the accusers were lying. The judges, who were also deeply committed to the Puritan purpose, convinced themselves that this was a necessary and righteous strategy to combat the devil, who could cloak himself in innocence. This shared belief gave the irrational system its necessary meaning. This system created an impossible psychological trap. The accused could not fight the spectre, only the person claiming to see it. Any attempt to deny the spectre's existence was seen as further evidence of the devil's deception. The only psychological comfort, the only viable purpose, left to the accused was to hold fast to the truth of their physical innocence, a form of inner resilience against a completely unhinged reality. The suspension of logic was the high watermark of the hysteria. By accepting an invisible enemy that could only be detected by a select few, the community effectively surrendered its collective rational capacity. It was only one step from this irrational certainty to the perverse logic of false confession. The trials progressed, and the community found itself trapped in a logic where silence meant guilt, and only confession offered a perverse salvation. The psychology of false confession. The true psychological horror of the witch hunt culminated in the wave of false confessions. In the face of a system that guaranteed death for denial, but promised a temporary reprieve for confession, the pursuit of survival became the ultimate, though tragic, human purpose. For many, confessing was not an admission of guilt, but a desperate final act of psychological resilience, a calculated decision to sacrifice truth to win more time, hoping for the madness to break. The community, too, preferred the confession. It resolved the cognitive dissonance created by the spectre and offered a tangible victory against the devil, reinforcing the narrative of their righteous purpose. The confessors were spared the noose and were used as witnesses to validate the entire panic, forcing them into a continuous, torturous role as collaborators with the lie. They had escaped the adversity of execution, only to live with the profound psychological adversity of moral compromise. This willingness to confess, even when innocent, speaks to the immense pressure of social terror and the human instinct for self-preservation. It is a powerful lesson in how easily an external threat can dismantle the individual's commitment to internal truth. The profound desire to survive superseded all other moral and rational calculations in the face of absolute domination. The ultimate irony is that the confessions, meant to confirm the reality of witchcraft, became the evidence that eventually discredited the entire process, as the sheer number of contradictory and impossible accounts became too absurd to sustain belief. The confession bought time, which was all that was needed for the collective conscience to begin its slow, painful reawakening. but the tide always turns when the fear begins to consume its own, when the accuser becomes the accused. The moment of doubt and reckoning. The turning point in Salem arrived when the panic began to consume the powerful. When Governor Phipp's own wife was whispered about, the hysteria struck too close to the source of authority. This personal stake, this sudden, sharp intrusion of adversity into his own life, provided the psychological clarity needed to break the spell. The fear that was tolerable when focused on the marginalized became intolerable when it threatened the established elite. Phipps's intervention was a reflection of the collective psychological breaking point. The community had reached a state of deep, painful exhaustion. The massive social cost, the months of terror, the empty jails, the mounting executions, had finally depleted the emotional energy required to sustain the delusion. The return to rational thought was not a sudden burst of enlightenment, but a profound, weary necessity, driven by the instinct for social and political self-preservation. The courts were suddenly forced to abandon spectral evidence, stripping the accusers of their dangerous, unprovable social power. This single, decisive act restored the necessary boundaries between the physical and the spiritual, allowing the community to return to a shared, verifiable reality. The pursuit of meaning through external combat was abandoned for the difficult, essential work of internal reckoning. The resilient human need for order was finally redirected toward establishing true legal purpose. Doubt, once the ultimate heresy, became the necessary medicine for the collective soul. The decision to prioritize logic over fear demonstrates the enduring, necessary resilience of the human mind to correct its most profound mistakes. The legal frenzy subsided, but the psychological wounds, the guilt, the shame, the memory, remained deep within the community. The aftermath of guilt and shame. The end of the witch hunt did not bring immediate peace, but a period of profound societal guilt and shame. The community was left with the devastating adversity of its own making, the memory of the innocent dead and the crushing realization that their pursuit of spiritual purpose had led to moral catastrophe. This psychological weight demanded years of slow, painful, collective atonement. The public apologies issued by key figures, including one of the judges and members of the jury, were essential steps in the psychological healing process. These acts of confession were the opposite of the false confessions. They were a genuine public reclamation of truth and moral meaning. By taking personal responsibility, they began to release the entire community from the crushing shared burden of guilt. The act of openly naming the injustice was the beginning of the journey back toward social trust. The ultimate resilience of the community was demonstrated in its long, quiet work to integrate this painful chapter. They sought to reclaim a genuine sense of purpose by correcting the historical record, reversing attainders, and providing restitution to the victims' families. This was the courageous process of finding true meaning through accountability and humility, replacing the destructive energy of blame with the constructive work of justice. The shame never vanished, but it was channeled into a commitment to vigilance against future panic. The Salem story remains a powerful testament to the human capacity for both destruction and, eventually, difficult, hard-won self-correction. The fires of Salem faded into history, but their underlying causes, the fear, the blame, the search for meaning, remain a universal shadow. The universal mirror. The final image of Salem is not one of fire or fury, but of slow, quiet rebuilding, the long, patient work of re-establishing trust. The townspeople, forever marked by their collective failure, had to look past the shadows of their shared hysteria and commit to seeing their neighbours not as potential witches, but as fellow humans struggling with life's universal adversity. This return to simple human empathy was the ultimate source of their hard-won peace. The story of the witch hunts is a universal mirror, reflecting back to us the primal psychological conditions that make moral panic possible. Whenever we face intense, uncontrollable adversity, economic stress, global conflict, or simple personal anxiety, we are vulnerable to the old temptation, the soothing, tragic comfort of finding meaning by externalizing blame. It is always easier to see the evil in the other than to confront the unsettling chaos within. The lesson of psychological resilience is not found in the accusations, but in the denial, the courage of those who chose inner truth over the safety of conformity. Their quiet strength is the truest model for finding purpose, a commitment to rational thought, a defense of the vulnerable, and a willingness to stand alone against the tide of collective fear. This is the meaning that endures, the quiet conviction that truth is the only path to lasting peace. As the quiet resolve of those who rebuilt fades into the night, we turn to our own inward journey, guided by the lessons of their pain, letting their search for meaning inform our own quest for rest. As the quiet resolve of those who rebuilt fades into the night, we turn to our own inward journey, guided by the lessons of their pain. Like them, we seek meaning and rest, often battling the ancient human impulse to find fault outside ourselves. Now let the story settle like dust in the quiet chambers of your mind. There is no need to resolve or categorize the events. Simply let the echoes of the historical figures, the accuser, the victim, the confused bystander, drift into the background. Picture your awareness now as a vast tranquil lake. Around the edges of this lake you may notice small disturbances, the lingering anxieties, the fears of adversity, the day's unresolved questions. These are your own personal shadows, the small forms of panic that seek a scapegoat in your own life. Do not engage them, simply observe them from the calm center of your mind. See them as small, dark clouds passing over the surface of the water, disturbing the reflection for only a moment before moving on. Allow the core lesson of this journey to settle deep within your body. True purpose is not found in the comfort of external blame, but in the quiet courage of inner peace. The most profound resilience is the choice to trust your own inner truth, to stand by your deepest convictions, and to find your anchor in the stillness of your own heart. This is the ultimate path out of the panic, a choice you make right now as you lie here safe and warm. Feel your body sinking deeper into the soft surrender of rest. Let your muscles grow heavy, your mind grow quiet. The external world, with all its noise and uncertainty, is held at bay by the quiet conviction of your own resilience. There are no shadows here, only rest. Breathe in the calm, breathe out the last vestiges of the day's fears. You have found your meaning in this moment of quiet. Let this peace carry you now. There are no longer boundaries between the historical lesson and your present comfort. You're simply floating, carried by the deep, restful current of your own profound purpose. Every muscle is soft, every thought is gentle. Let the silence speak the only truth that matters. You are safe, you are held, you are at peace. History's souls, from the accused of Europe to the deniers of Salem, sought meaning through adversity, guiding us to the truth that the greatest peace is found within. As their powerful stories now fade into the quiet background of the past, allow your own thoughts to rest, carried by the profound truth of their journey. Let go of all effort, all worry, all need to search. Your courage is your own. Your peace is your own. Drift now into deep, restful dreams.